All right, so you've given us quite the sack of stuff on The Godfather.
Yeah.
Really going deep on the 1972 film today.
Yeah, great movie.
It is. And you even sent over the Wikipedia plot summary.
Gotta have that.
Yeah, so we've got all our bases covered here for this deep dive. But just a heads up, this is going to get interesting.
Yeah, it should.
I mean, do you know, for example, that oranges in the film, they aren't just snacks.
Oh, this is interesting.
Yeah, they actually symbolize impending doom.
Really?
And that, the baptism scene everyone knows.
One of the most famous scenes in cinema.
Yeah, juxtaposed against the murders.
Mm.
Well, there's a reason it's so powerful, and we're going to unpack all that and more today.
Okay, great.
So,
what I think is so interesting about The Godfather is it's so much more than just a gangster movie.
Right.
Crime drama, sure.
Yeah.
But it goes way beyond that, right? It gets into family, loyalty, ambition, the corrupting influence of power, all that good stuff.
Yeah, no, totally. And to your point, let's actually unpack Michael Corleone's journey here, right?
Yep.
At the start of the film, he's this idealistic war hero. We see him at his sister's wedding.
Right.
He seems detached from the family business, or, we'll call it the family business.
Line of work.
Yeah, exactly. The line of work.
Right.
But then, his father, the Don, gets shot.
Everything changes.
Yeah.
Huge turning point in the film.
Yeah.
That attempted assassination is really what sets Michael on this path, and what makes it even more compelling is that he's so reluctant at first to get involved.
Right.
But then he just fully embraces the family business. And it's this, descent into darkness that is so, so fascinating.
And, what I think is interesting is that it's not just Michael.
Yeah.
The entire family is kind of in this moral gray area, right?
Right.
They value loyalty above all else.
Right.
But their business is brutal.
Absolutely. And it clashes, right? Those two things.
Oh, right. Yeah. And we see that with, Sonny, for example.
Yeah. Sonny's hot-headedness.
Yeah. It leads to his demise. And then, of course, who could forget Fredo?
The ultimate betrayal.
Oh, man.
Right in the family.
Right. So much going on there.
I think the film does such a good job of constantly making you question, what is right and wrong here. You see that in the opening scene, remember? The Undertaker, Bonacera.
Yeah, that's a great scene.
Right, and he goes to Don Vito for help because the justice system failed him.
Right, it completely failed him.
So right away you're thrown into this dilemma.
Yeah.
What is justice, right?
Yeah, and you're kind of rooting for the Don a little bit.
On the one hand,
you can't condone his methods, but you kind of see his point.
But on the other hand, you see how desperate Bonacera is, right?
Yeah, and you almost put yourself in that position. Would I do the same thing?
Yeah, it really makes you think.
Yeah, and it makes you think. And that's what's so genius about the film.
Yeah, it doesn't give you these easy answers. It just throws these hard questions at you, right? These moral questions. And then, on top of all that, visually, it's a masterpiece.
Yeah, so true. And speaking of visually, the cinematography by Gordon Willis, absolutely stunning.
Yeah, the Prince of Darkness. I love that nickname.
Right. So low-key lighting, the shadows, wow.
He was a master of chiaroscuro, the way he plays with light and dark.
Oh, yeah. Chiaroscuro.
But it's not just an aesthetic choice.
Right.
It's a visual metaphor.
Yeah.
It reflects that moral ambiguity we were talking about.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Right, so you're moving between, clarity and darkness, just like the characters.
Oh, and it makes me think of the scene with Vito, right? When he's buying the oranges.
Before he gets shot, yeah.
Yeah, and I never thought about this way before, but those oranges, they weren't just randomly there, right?
Well, the oranges, right, they keep popping up, and it's usually when something bad's about to happen.
Oh, wow.
So it's like a subtle cue that things are about to go down. It's really, shows how meticulously crafted the film is.
It's so true.
Yeah.
And then how can we, forget about the baptism scene?
Masterful. Yeah. The way that it cuts back and forth, right?
Yeah.
Between the baptism and the murders,
Yeah.
Incredible tension.
Right.
And it really highlights, I think, that dark path that Michael is on.
Yeah, no, totally. It really shows you there's no going back at that point.
He's in too deep.
Yeah, he's in way too deep.
Yeah, and there's actually a term for that, right? It's called the Godfather effect.
Oh, yeah, the Godfather effect, right?
What does that even mean, though?
Yeah, what is that? How would you define it?
It really refers to the impact the film had on how people view organized crime,
Yeah?
Even though it's fiction, it's shaped how we think about the mafia.
It really has.
Both in pop culture, but also in the real world.
Yeah, no, totally. And
it's not just the story itself.
Right.
but how that story, it's almost seeped into our culture,
And it's shaped how we think about these things, these themes, family, power, all of that.
Totally. And speaking of family and power, like Marlon Brando as Don Vito Corleone, I mean, come on.
Iconic performance.
That's so iconic.
He just, he embodies that authority, that quiet menace.
Yeah.
And he does it so subtly.
It's so subtle.
His voice, too.
Yeah.
Right. Like so soothing, but also kind of terrifying at the same time.
Oh, so true. You totally buy it when he's making you an offer. You can't refuse.
Right.
And then Al Pacino as Michael, his transformation, it's mesmerizing.
It really is.
It's just like, how did he pull that off?
He just, captures that internal struggle so precisely. And you really see that idealism just fade away as he gets deeper and deeper into the family business.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a slow burn.
It is.
But it just draws you in.
And, I think it's not just, the leads.
Yeah, no.
The supporting cast is incredible.
Phenomenal.
Like James Caan as Sonny Nance.
Yeah.
Robert Duvall is Tom Hagen.
Tom Hagen.
John Cazale is Fredo.
It's like you're looking into a real family.
All their flaws, right?
Right. The complexity.
Yeah, it's what makes it so rich.
Yeah, it's a rich
and compelling. And you're right. Like we've talked about Michael, we've talked about, the visuals, we've talked about those performances.
Yeah.
But The Godfather is so much more.
Yeah.
It's this cultural touchstone.
It is, and it still resonates, all these years later.
Yeah, it does.
And people still watch it.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And speaking of all this, like, what about all the other stuff we haven't gotten into yet? Like the editing.
Oh, yeah.
The score. Yeah. The costumes.
Those crucial elements.
Like, they all kind of play a part in the overall power of this.
Yeah, you can't just focus on the story.
Right.
The filmmaking is just, on another level.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, let's actually dig into the editing, for example. Right? It's brilliant, especially in that baptism scene.
So much going on.
We've talked about, but it's not just, about making those moments visually cool.
No.
It's about, like, how does that contribute to the story?
Emotional impact. Right?
Emotional impact, exactly.
Yeah.
So how does that all work?
Well, editor William Reynolds, he's cutting between all these different scenes, different storylines, and he's really creating this tension, this suspense, pulling you deeper and deeper into the world of the Corleones.
Yeah.
He's really playing with your emotions.
And then the score, right?
Oh, and Rhoda.
Rhoda. It's so hauntingly beautiful.
Yeah, it really sets the mood.
It really does, right?
Yeah.
And, you hear Speak Softly, Love.
Oh, the main theme.
Right. And it's romantic, but it's also kind of melancholy.
Yeah. It captures the film perfectly.
Right.
Love, loss, violence, all mixed together.
Yeah. It's just it's so amazing how all that comes through in that one.
Yeah. And the score is so important to how you feel when you're watching, Like it adds these layers of meaning.
Yeah.
To the relationships, to the characters.
And even the silences.
Yeah. The silences are powerful.
It's true.
Right? You need those moments to absorb everything.
Right. They speak volumes, don't they?
They do.
And then, like, we can't forget the costumes, right?
Oh, so meticulous. Right. They reflect the characters.
Totally.
The era.
Yeah.
So well done.
And, thinking about all these pieces together, from the acting to the editing to the costumes, like, it's amazing how it all just works in harmony to create this
masterpiece.
Right. Enduring work of art.
It really is a testament to, Coppola's vision and everyone else, all the artists, the craftspeople who worked on it.
Right. And The Godfather really is a masterpiece.
It is.
And, its influence is still felt today.
Okay, sure.
Before we wrap up this first part, I do want to ask you something, though. We've talked about Michael's transformation.
Yeah.
The film's exploration of power and morality.
Right.
But what about the women?
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. What about the women in The Godfather?
Yeah.
Because their roles are, they might seem secondary, but I actually think they're quite complex.
I think you're right, yeah. They're often, operating in the shadows.
Right.
But they have power.
They have power, yeah.
Within the family,
Totally. And think about, like, Kay Adams.
Yeah, Michael's wife.
Right. She starts off as this innocent outsider.
Right. She's not part of that world.
Right. But as she gets more involved, like, you see her own transformation.
Yeah. Kay's journey is fascinating.
Isn't it?
Yeah, because she represents this conflict,
Yeah.
between her values, like traditional values.
Right.
and this world she marries into.
Right. It's like this clash.
It's a huge clash
of, values. Yeah. And I think, a lot of women during that era probably felt
Absolutely. And it adds so much depth to the film.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then you have Connie Corleone, Michael's sister.
Oh, Connie.
She's trapped in this cycle of abuse.
It's sad, really.
It is. And her story really highlights, the dark side of that patriarchal structure.
Of the family. Yeah. And the mafia in general.
Yeah.
Yeah. Connie's experiences, they show how limited the options were for women in that world.
Right.
She's really a tragic figure.
Yeah, she is.
And I think her story adds this layer of social commentary to the film.
Right.
About power, about corruption.
Totally. And, so even though the women might not be calling their shots in the same way
right.
as the men, they're still super important to understanding the film.
Absolutely.
And the power dynamics.
Yeah, they give you these insights into the social and cultural context of the time.
Right.
Yeah, and they just, they add this emotional depth that makes The Godfather even better.
Totally. Yeah, and we've covered a lot of ground in this first part.
Yeah, we have.
But we're just getting started.
We've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
There's so much more to talk about.
So much more to talk about. Before we move on, I want to ask you a question, dear listener.
Okay.
Think back to that opening scene with Bonacera, right? Yeah. And how it sets up that central question.
Of justice, right?
Of justice.
What is it?
And how do you think that sets the stage for everything that comes later?
Yeah, all those dilemmas.
All those moral dilemmas, right? Mm-hmm. And those complex choices.
Keep that in mind as we continue our deep dive.
Exactly. Keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Because we're going to keep exploring.
Yeah, we are.
Okay, so we talked about the visuals and the characters.
Yeah.
But The Godfather also, caused some controversy, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Doesn't it kind of romanticize the mafia, a little bit?
I think that's a valid point. It's something that people have been talking about since the film came out, Because it is a fictional story. But it brings up these questions about how organized crime is portrayed and whether it makes it seem glamorous, which is dangerous, right?
Right. And it's interesting because on the one hand, you have these very human characters with these strong family ties. But then, they're doing these awful things.
They are. It's a tough balance.
Yeah, it is tough balance.
And I think that's where the film is so smart,
Right.
It doesn't shy away from the violence or the moral compromises that the characters make. It's a very nuanced view of the mafia, I think. It shows the allure, but also the consequences.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. And it almost reminds me of, Shakespeare,
Like
a Corleone family has this epic quality to it, right?
Yeah.
With all the betrayals and power struggles and, the tragic downfall, it's all there.
That's a great comparison. Definitely some tragic elements there. But I think unlike Shakespeare, The Godfather really gets into the nitty-gritty of organized crime, right?
Right.
It feels so authentic.
Yeah. And part of that authenticity, I think, is because of those performances.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we've talked about Brando and Pacino.
Yeah, incredible.
But everyone in the cast is just, phenomenal.
So good, yeah. They just feel so real,
Yeah, they feel real, like you're eavesdropping on real conversations. Okay. It's not just lines being delivered.
It adds so much to the realism.
Yeah, it totally does.
For sure.
And speaking of realism, I've always been fascinated by how they use the locations in the film.
Oh, yeah.
You really feel like you're there in New York.
Yeah, New York, Sicily. It's brilliant because the locations aren't just backdrops.
Right.
They're part of the story.
Yeah.
The Corleone compound on Staten Island, it feels like its own little world, Yeah,
it's like a fortress.
A fortress, exactly. And it really represents their power and how isolated they are from everything else.
And those scenes in Sicily.
Oh, beautiful.
It's like you've stepped back in time.
They're so important, though, to understanding the family's history.
Right, where they came from.
Their roots, right? And that code of honor that they live by.
Yeah.
And I think the contrast between Sicily and New York, the rural beauty and the urban grit, it highlights this clash that Michael's experiencing.
Right, and it adds another layer to his journey.
Absolutely. He's trying to figure out where he belongs in both worlds.
Yeah.
Visually, those Sicilian scenes are just, stunning.
Yeah, they are.
The way the light hits the landscape, it's just...
Oh, it's beautiful.
Gorgeous.
So we talked about how The Godfather has influenced how we see organized crime.
Right.
But what about its impact on, actual filmmaking?
I mean, it changed everything, It really revolutionized the gangster genre.
Yeah, how so? Can you give some examples?
Well, for one, it broke away from those typical Hollywood tropes, you know, good guys, bad guys.
Yeah.
It showed the mafia in a more complex light. And the storytelling, it set a new standard, you know? And then after The Godfather, all these gangster movies started using those techniques, like the slow burning tension, the realistic dialogue, the morally ambiguous characters. But not many films have been able to do it as well.
Yeah, and it's not just gangster films either, right? Like
exactly. It's like it raised the bar for storytelling.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
In general.
It's incredible to think about.
Yeah, it really is. It's like it's a legacy, how it still inspires people today.
So before we move on, I kind of want to circle back to Michael for a second.
Okay, yeah.
We've talked about his journey, right? He starts out wanting nothing to do with the family business.
Yeah.
And then he ends up being even more ruthless than his father.
Right.
What do you make of that?
I mean, it's really the heart of the film, you know?
Yeah.
It's tragic in a lot of ways because he's an idealist, but then power corrupts him.
Right.
Until he becomes the very thing he hated. It's like that saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Exactly. And Michael shows how seductive power can be, you know?
Yeah.
He wants to protect his family, but in the process, he loses himself.
And it's like a cautionary tale.
It is.
About ambition.
Yeah.
And the compromises people make for power.
And those choices have consequences.
They do.
For everyone.
Yeah. And it's a message that I think people still need to hear today.
Oh, yeah, for sure, for sure.
So before we move on to the last part of our deep dive, I have another question for you, dear listener.
All right.
We've talked about how Michael's journey is a tragedy.
Yeah.
But could he have escaped?
That's the question.
Like, was he always going to end up this way? Think about that as we go into the final part of our deep dive. So we've really gone deep into the world of The Godfather, right?
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
Explored Michael's, that whole tragic transformation.
Okay.
We even talked about all the controversy around the film.
Right, right. But I think it all kind of comes back to this central question.
Mm-hmm.
What is The Godfather actually saying about the American dream?
It's interesting, right? Because on the surface, it is a classic immigrant story.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Like coming from nothing, building an empire, you know.
Right. Rags to riches, all that.
Yeah. But it also shows you the dark side of that dream.
Right.
Like what you have to do to achieve it.
Yeah. And it's like they achieve the American dream, but in this like totally messed up way.
By subverting the whole idea of it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So it kind of makes you think, is that the only way?
I don't think the film gives you a clear answer.
Right.
But it definitely suggests that power, even if you get it through hard work, it can corrupt you, destroy you.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you see why people want it so bad, right? Yeah. They want to provide for their family, leave their mark on the world.
And I think that's what makes it so relatable, even today.
Yeah.
Because it's like, how far would I go?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
What would I do?
What lines are you willing to cross?
Exactly.
And it's not just about the mafia,
Right.
It's about all of us.
Yeah, no, totally. And, you talked a bit about the film's legacy.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious, like, why do you think it's had such a huge cultural impact?
Well, I mean, it's everywhere, right?
It really is.
Parodies, quotes, references.
It's like built into the culture.
It has, and I think it's because it deals with these universal themes, right?
Right.
Family, loyalty, ambition, betrayal.
Yeah, yeah. And it also feels so real.
It does.
Even though it's a made-up story.
You feel like you know these characters,
Yeah, their struggles, their pain.
Yeah, and even the violence.
Yeah.
Feels so real. And I think part of that is Coppola's attention to detail.
Yeah.
He really did his research.
Yeah.
He was inspired by real people and events.
Right.
And then the actors, they brought their own experiences to the roles.
Right.
So it just adds this depth.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what really struck me during this deep dive? The silence.
Oh, interesting.
The way The Godfather uses silence.
Yeah, like after something really bad happens.
Yeah, yeah.
It's almost worse than the violence itself.
It's almost like it makes you think even more.
It does.
About what you just saw.
Yeah, you need that space to process it.
Yeah.
It's like the film is saying, hey, pay attention. This is important.
Yeah, you see how it affects them.
Main characters, yeah.
Like how it just eats away at them.
Right, it's not just physical violence.
Yes.
There's the emotional, psychological damage too.
Totally, yeah.
And those moments of silence, they give you time to think about all that.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into The Godfather.
Yeah, it's been a journey.
What final thoughts do you have? Like, what's the one thing you want our listener to take away?
I hope they see it as more than just a gangster film, you know?
Right.
It's a work of art. It's thought-provoking. It says so much about human nature.
Yeah, the power, the violence, the family ties.
It's all connected.
Yeah, yeah.
And even when those ties are strained, they're still there.
And for you, dear listener, one last thing to think about.
Okay.
We talked about Michael's downfall.
Right.
But what if that was his goal all along?
Interesting.
To achieve the American dream no matter what.
Even if he had to compromise his morals.
Exactly, yeah. Does that change how you see him? How you see the film? It's something to think about.
Definitely.
As you watch The Godfather again, maybe.
Always worth a rewatch.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been fun.
We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.
Looking forward to it.